Justin, Chris, thanks for being on the show. Excited to talk about your research on China, specifically that of the China's dual capable delivery systems. So if we can maybe start with introductions. You just introduce yourself. We'll start with you, Chris.
Yeah, so my name's Chris Andrews. I'm a policy fellow here at the Center for the Study of WMD. Came aboard a few years ago as a China specialist. Obviously, in recent years, China's nuclear program has expanded significantly and it's got a lot of attention. The demand signal's gone up. And my background just happens to coincide with working on China affairs and nuclear affairs.
Oh, very nice. Yeah. Justin, please.
I'm Justin Anderson. I'm the Deputy Director of the Center for the Study of Weapons Mass Destruction here at National Defense University's Institute for National Strategic Studies. And prior to working at the center, I was a contractor working for SAIC, primarily on contracts for the Air Force.
Again, it's a pleasure to have you both. So the call to research. So what got you both started on this project? Maybe just kind of start there, what kind of drivers there, specifically looking at the China's dual delivery systems. Could you just talk about what these things are?
Yeah, so China's theater range dual capable systems are a set of offensive weapons that are run by the PLA that can carry both conventional explosive payloads and nuclear explosive payloads. China has a nuclear triad that has a land-based component, a sea-based component, and an air-based component. Kind of the joke among analysts, at least in circles that I've been in, is that if you think about a nuclear triad as a tricycle, China's nuclear triad is really more like a unicycle that has training wheels on it. The PLA rocket force and the land-based component of it comprise the vast majority in terms of numbers and capabilities of China's nuclear triad. And within that, there are two dual capable systems of interest that had our attention during this report. One is the land-based DF-26 missile. That's a road mobile intermediate range ballistic missile that's capable of carrying a nuclear or conventional payload, and importantly, it can conduct precision strike operations within its theater. The other system of interest that had some of our attention, but admittedly less than the DF-26, was an air-based platform called the H-6N, which is a Chinese bomber that can carry a nuclear-capable ballistic missile. So the H-6N is obviously a theater-ranging system. It's dual-capable. The key distinction between these two systems is that you can identify what kind of payload an H-6N has by looking at it, because the missile is carried on the outside of the airframe.
The nuclear-capable one.
The nuclear-capable missile is visible if you look at the plane. A DF-26 has no such external indicator of what kind of payload is inside. It's a really clever engineering design by the Chinese, because one of the features of the DF-26 is that it has the capability of being hot swapped in the field. So in other words, if a DF-26 is deployed on a mission, the Chinese have the capability of swapping the payload, whether it's conventional for nuclear or vice versa, within a matter of minutes on deployment. So they don't need to take all the time required to take the warhead out of storage and move it to the right location and arm the weapon before it goes out on deployment. In theory, they can do so in the field. So the fact that these systems, the H-6N and the DF-26, could conduct either conventional or nuclear missions means that U.S. planners would have to account for both conventional and nuclear strike operations on the part of the adversary. That creates complications in terms of targeting, it creates complications in terms of strategic messaging and intent, and it creates complications because of the precision strike capability, which means that any forward deployed U.S. forces in theater are at risk. So there's an automatic built-in nuclear deterrent capability, which is very important for China, alongside a very formidable conventional warfighting capability. These are really dangerous and really interesting systems.
Yeah, and the only thing I'll add is some listeners might be familiar with the former Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, which was in place between the United States and Soviet Union and then Russian Federation. And this addressed a type of two types of ground launch nuclear capable systems, ballistic missiles and cruise missiles, that were intermediate range. That means a range that's below 5,500 kilometers, which is considered intercontinental or strategic range. So we're talking about systems that can range things in theater, but not hit homeland to homeland. But that INF treaty, that again, it doesn't exist between the U.S. and Russian Federation anymore, but did for a number of years. China was never a part of it. And both the United States and actually the Russian Federation asked if China would be interested a number of years ago, and China had no interest whatsoever. So they've never been limited by treaty constraints or anything else from building these types of systems.
Yep. So in sum, three things that are important about these systems: they're formidable warfighting tools that exist in the theater that confuse the issue of whether there's a conventional or a nuclear fight on hand, and the U.S. doesn't have a direct analog for those systems in theater.
Chris, Justin, thank you so much for explaining that. There's a lot of people maybe asking that question.
Well, they're really challenging systems, so we need more people to be informed about them. Yeah, so I already mentioned the rapid expansion and modernization of China's nuclear capability in recent years. It's caught so much public attention in large part because a few years ago, the open source using satellite imagery identified a bunch of brand new silo fields that were being constructed in Western China. And those are probably going to be filled with intercontinental range ballistic missiles that have nuclear warheads on them. So that's obviously a significant expansion of China's strategic nuclear capability. And we also realize that it's important. While it's important to look at the strategic capabilities at that large intercontinental level, there's also been rapid expansion and improvement in China's capability at the theater ranging level. So within the Western Pacific, China's magazine of ballistic missiles has gotten a lot deeper, and it's also expanded its ability to use nuclear weapons to hold targets at risk in that area. And so that kind of creates a sort of gap in the deterrence focus when it comes to dealing with a rising nuclear peer. And so the question on our end was, how do those intermediate range systems within that gap affect our approach to dealing with crises and conflicts in the Western Pacific? And specifically, the dual capability of those systems raises some questions also about how do we understand these types of targets from a deterrence point of view. The precision strike capability with these systems allows them to hold targets at risk with conventional payloads, but they can also carry nuclear payloads, which changes the dynamics of both deterrence and potentially conflict. And so that creates really unique challenges for us because of the scale of the conflict and because of the dual capable nature of the systems. And so we thought that was worth a deep dive in addition to looking at China's broader nuclear expansion.
Yeah, a lot of the focus is on China's, what is often termed their strategic nuclear forces. So these are the forces that could have the range of being launched from the Chinese homeland or close to it and ranging the United States of America. And it's understandable why we need to be paying very close attention to those systems. But in addition to that, as Chris noted, they also have these other systems that could be armed with nuclear or conventional payloads. There are different types of systems, so we'll talk a little bit about that later, both bombers and also mobile ballistic missiles that are ground launched. So these are systems that would range targets in the Indo-Pacific theater, U.S. bases, U.S. forces, Allied bases, Allied forces. So they're a little bit different than the strategic nuclear forces that, again, understandably get a lot of attention. But we wanted to focus on why is China also building up this type of force, and what could it mean for a future Indo-Pacific crisis or conflict?
So keeping that in mind, what are some assumptions that you had going into your research, and then why did you have those particular assumptions?
Well, one of the big ones that we had was that China's nuclear strategy and doctrine, their kind of intellectual understanding of how nuclear weapons affect strategy, we assumed that that would stay generally consistent, mostly because it has for really decades. China first exploded a nuclear device on October 16, 1964, and since then it's largely been a deterrent force that was about keeping the larger nuclear powers at bay, meaning then the Soviet Union, eventually Russia, and the United States, and just doing enough to preserve that deterrent. And that comes with a lot of institutional inertia about how nuclear weapons fit into the broader military strategic thinking inside that country. So we assumed that that inertia would generally continue even though there's a rapid expansion of the type and number of capabilities that China has at its disposal. So we kind of checked that assumption as we continued with our research because for a long time, China's nuclear capabilities were at that strategic level where the things that they're looking at are intercontinental. They're across the other side of the globe. They didn't really have the capability to hold targets at risk with nuclear weapons inside the theater. So we had to go forward with that assumption about China's nuclear strategy and doctrine. But we also wanted to keep it in mind as we were doing our research, because with this new suite of capabilities at that lower level, that theater level, that might necessitate a change in the strategy and doctrinal thinking.
And these are really important insights. So as you were deriving them, what kind of methodology did you use to test or to assess your assumptions?
Yeah, we used a range of primary and secondary sources. We conducted interviews with, I believe, 38 subject matter experts, both in government and outside of government. And of course, we consulted secondary sources, reports, journal articles, both US and Chinese, that were relevant to this topic area. But in addition to that sort of pretty standard approach to research for a problem like this, another element that we added was we're very fortunate here at NDU to have some fantastic war gamers. And so our Center for Applied Strategic Learning, CASTLE, we sat down with them and with their help developed a simple Indo-Pacific crisis and conflict scenario, which put the scenario player in the shoes of a Chinese commander that had access to both nuclear and conventional forces. Because we didn't want to presuppose or bias the way people would respond by saying you're only in charge of nuclear stuff. And we put them into this crisis and conflict scenario and asked, say, hey, you have the whole toolbox at your disposal of these military capabilities, the same ones that China has currently developed. How would you use them in the event of, a future crisis or conflict? And obviously, we are not able to go directly to Chinese military officers and ask them how they might think about possibly employing these forces, or how they'd advise their senior policy officials on how to do so. But we went to a lot of very smart people who think on these topics and know a lot about them, and ask them to run through this scenario and use that as another way to gain some data that we incorporated back into the report.
We did want to ask also, how did you conduct your analysis of the data that you collected? So was that the part where you ended up going and conducting the interviews? But after conducting the interviews, how did the analytic process ensue?
With a number of the experts, we were able to do both. We had a set of questions actually a couple sets of questions, which we would tailor to the expertise of the person at hand. For some of the individuals who were really more in sort of the policy area, we didn't necessarily ask them to run through the scenario. But for those whose expertise or experience made them a good fit for that piece, that's where we would incorporate the scenario as well. So we looked to gather a lot of data, to test kind of that testable assumption that Chris noted at the top. And found actually things are perhaps different with these systems, and there is a way to, or it is important to look at them as something that is different in the way that China is thinking about its overall nuclear forces, and probably different in the way China would think about the role those forces could play in coercion or aggression in the Indo-Pacific.
That's fascinating. And now I want to talk a little bit about your findings. Could you elaborate on your references in the paper on China's theory of victory and how the delivery systems fit within that particular framework?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a set of responses that fits neatly into kind of the first bin of the organization of the project, which is understanding the threat perspective. China's theory of victory, generally speaking, is to try to win without fighting. I think that's kind of a cliche term because people attribute it to Sun Tzu, and that's technically correct, but really what we're after here is a set of political conditions from China's point of view that requires them to expend the least number of resources in order to gain the most. When it comes to nuclear weapons and how they fit into that theory of victory, China understands nuclear weapons generally as having a lot of political and strategic value, and that's because of the deterrent effect that they have. The flip side of that would be that China doesn't really think that nuclear weapons have a ton of operational or tactical value. That's because of a kind of bifurcation in how the PLA, generally speaking, understands the ability to control escalation within a conflict. one of the publications that comes out of the PLA every so often is something called the Science of Military Strategy.
Yeah.
That title itself should tell you that they understand military affairs and conflicts in a particular way, and that is that with the right scientific understanding and application of forces, you can kind of control escalation. But there's a fire break between conventional conflict and when nuclear weapons are introduced. They think that escalation is virtually impossible to control once nuclear weapons come into play. And so the question that China might be answering here is, what's the right mix of nuclear forces as they continue to expand their arsenal? What's the right blend that will allow them to achieve their political objectives, in particular around Taiwan, without having to resort to potentially uncontrollable nuclear escalation? There was a really excellent work done by one of our colleagues here at NDU in INSS and the Center for the Study of China Military Affairs, Dr. Phil Saunders, as well as Dr. David Logan, who I think is at Tufts University right now. They did a really excellent monograph outlining basic explanations for why China is expanding its arsenal so much. And one of the possible explanations that they came up with, that there's strong evidence for, is that China is using its nuclear weapons as a sort of shield to give themselves more space at the regional level and in the operational sphere, especially within their own neighborhood. And with nuclear weapons filling in those lower rungs on the escalation ladder, that might give more room at the theater level for their conventional forces to do what it is they need to do while keeping the United States at bay. That's another key element of the theory of victory. China doesn't want to expend any resources, and they want to have as few parties involved as possible. The nuclear posture in China is oriented toward keeping the United States out of China's neighborhood so that they can do what they need to do and control their sphere of influence. And so if they can keep the United States out, and if they can discourage allies of the United States in the region, notably think Japan, think South Korea, if they can keep those parties discouraged and uninterested in introducing the possibility of nuclear retaliation to their own list of concerns, then China is going to be successful. And so the theory of victory involves having the right balance of nuclear forces that allows China to get those deterrence benefits without having to escalate.
I think Chris has hit on something really important here and a central part of our findings, that on the one hand, China doesn't have interest in engaging in nuclear war fighting with the United States. Right. It recognizes that's a recipe for disaster and a recipe for losing a conflict in theater that probably in the not too distant future, it will feel like it might have a conventional advantage. That if it can keep the conflict conventional, it's more likely to win. But at the same time, where they're not necessarily leaning into things like nuclear strikes for the purposes of warfighting, there's a recognition that just the threat of casting a nuclear shadow over the theater of conflict, over conventional operations, allows you to make it more difficult for another force's policymakers to say, this conflict is worth it and we want to engage and intervene. It makes it more difficult for those military forces on the opposing side, who now has to at least consider the possibility you might employ something like a in-theater nuclear strike as a part of a combined conventional nuclear warfighting strategy. So you can both have a recognition that nuclear warfighting is not something that you want to do because there are too many variables and risks involved, while at the same time understanding there's a way to leverage this new capability, new and growing capability of theater range dual capable forces, and lean into the fact that it just casts a nuclear shadow, it poses a nuclear threat that enables your conventional operations. And this is something that Chris and I have talked about when we've had the chance to outbrief this to various groups. Look, this isn't a couple of nuclear guys just talking about nuclear stuff because we're interested in it, although we are.
We are, very much.
We are making an argument that these systems matter because they will actually have a possibly very important role in what would be an otherwise conventional conflict.
That's right.
If it manages to keep our allies sidelined because they're worried about the possibility of nuclear employment against their own military forces or their capitals, if it makes us hesitate and pull our punches because we're a little a little bit slower to respond because we have to think about this nuclear stuff, then you have given yourself an advantage for virtually no cost. You just cast a nuclear threat, you maybe do a little bit of nuclear signaling. You haven't done anything further, and you've given yourself an advantage that could be, a quantitative and qualitative advantage for the conventional fight you expect to come.
Yeah. Fantastic. I want to switch to recommendations then, since what you've laid out is going to be something that strategists try to wrap their head around. So what sort of U.S. integrated deterrence approach would you recommend?
Well, one thing that we talk about within the report that is important is this concept of conventional nuclear integration, or CNI. It might be familiar to some people listening to the pod, but for those who aren't familiar with it, this is an umbrella concept to address a range of challenges that we, the U.S. and our allies, recognize we now face from exactly adversaries that field these types of systems, these systems that are nuclear systems that they might consider utilizing in various ways within a conflict. So if there's a nuclear shadow over future regional battlefields, then what are some of the ways you can try to counter that? Conventional nuclear integration talks about the importance of being prepared to fight through a radiologically contaminated environment. It's a very sobering thing to have to think about if you're conventional forces and you have to contemplate that. But if you're prepared for the possibility that you might face an adversary who would conduct tactical nuclear strikes, and you have an awareness of there are ways to navigate that problem, that battlefield, would never minimize the effects at the actual point of attack. But depending on the yield of a warhead, if it's, and this, I'm going to put this in quotes, low yield is somewhat in the eye of the beholder. Right. But there are potential nuclear attacks an adversary might use against U.S. or allied forces, where again, bad news if you're at that point of attack. But even a few kilometers away, you're going to be able to continue to operate and continue to fight. Right. And it would be a fundamental error if we were to just stop. Right. Based on a single nuclear strike of not a particularly large yield. But this is something we haven't really thought about or encountered. Obviously, we haven't thought about it since the Cold War. Fortunately, we've never encountered it on the battlefield. Right. Also, the concept of conventional nuclear integration is how do we think about synchronizing our own conventional and nuclear forces? Right. Let me give just for example. If we're engaged in a regional conflict with an adversary who has some of these theater range dual capable systems, and our conventional forces are engaged with that adversary, it might be important to, at the same time, conduct nuclear deterrence operations by doing things like rotating B-52s into theater, maybe taking other actions where we're displaying we have a nuclear capability that can be visible in theater. Don't think you, the adversary, are able to threaten or escalate up to the threshold of nuclear employment without the possibility that the U.S. is prepared to respond. Now, that is a nuclear deterrence operation, but it's to enable our own conventional forces to fight.
And I'd also add to that, there's a need to get on the same page with the different combatant commands, especially the geographic combatant command that's going to be responsible for prosecuting a conflict, and the supporting combatant command, STRATCOM, which has its finger on the nuclear button, so to speak. To their credit, I think there's been a recognition of the fact that those two COCOMs are going to have to be on the same page in terms of planning and execution, because any kind of crisis or conflict with China is going to have a nuclear character from the outset. And that's why conventional nuclear integration is so important. And to their credit, that has also meant that planning has improved. Synchronized planning has gotten a lot better. And now I think it's just a matter of continuing to build that muscle. And that comes in the form of doing more exercises together to make sure that we're ready to implement the plans that have gotten a lot more synchronized over the last several years. And so that's just going to have to be work that DoD does to make sure that the COCOMs are on the same page. And our allies as well. That's obviously very important because they're such key partners for us in any kind of crisis or conflict. And we've all got to be on the same page when it comes to conventional nuclear integration.
There's one other area that we highlight, and I just mentioned here. Within the European theater, through dual capable aircraft, we have a nuclear capability, us and our allies, that's fundamentally important to the way NATO does extended deterrence. We don't really have anything equivalent in the Indo-Pacific theater. We don't have a capability, a visible capability in theater that could play a similar type of role. So one of the things that we talk about is if it is a problem that there is a capability gap, and we think there are some issues with that,
certainly,
that China has a capability that there really isn't a U.S. equivalent, then perhaps we should think about in the future changing the way we do our regional nuclear deterrence posture in the Indo-Pacific. There could be a few different ways to think about that. One thing that we highlight within the report is to say that the B-21 Raider, which is started to fly, when we start, in a few years, we'll have wings of B-21s. They will do a lot of important things for us. But we think that it could be valuable to start talking about the regional nuclear deterrence role that B-21 will play, even though it's not in theater yet, but will play into the future, because we know that China thinks and worries a lot about U.S. stealth capabilities.
Certainly, yeah.
So let's think about ways in which the B-21 Raider will be able to help assure Indo-Pacific allies, as well as deal with China and other nuclear threats that are growing within this region. And let's go ahead and start to think about, talk about, tabletop exercise that capability. Let's go ahead and do that now, even in advance of when that capability will first appear in theater in a few years.
Fantastic. And if I can just ask, so we have a wide variety of audiences. This is very valuable insight and information research. Which audiences or what type of organizations could find greatest value in this that you think should definitely pick up this report and read it?
Well, I think first and foremost, DTRA, which is the organization that sponsored our research.
The Defense Threat Reduction Agency.
The Defense Threat Reduction Agency.
I'm just making sure in case anybody doesn't know.
Yeah, critically important support organization for DoD as we go forward into a more nuclear challenging type of world, and DoD at large. I think, generally speaking, our national level of nuclear literacy is regrettably low. We've been fortunate to be worried about things that are not nuclear threats for a long time. And we've just kind of lost that sort of muscle memory that we had during the Cold War, when deterrence was part and parcel with U.S. national security strategy. I think that this is good information for a broader audience to become a little bit more familiar with. Certainly practitioners within DoD and within supporting organizations, especially within the combatant commands as well. Obviously STRATCOM does this every day, so I'm not so sure that they need to listen carefully to every word that we're saying. But certainly they're going to be a key component to implementing all of the things that we're recommending here.
I'll cheat and answer anyone interested in foreign policy and national security strategy, but let me explain why. Unfortunately, we, the United States and our democratic allies, face autocratic adversaries like Russia and China and North Korea that have increasingly demonstrated a real interest in how they can take nuclear capabilities and through various means threaten and coerce U.S. allies and partners in the United States itself in ways that have strategic effects. For too long, we've thought of nuclear strategy as something that exists in a separate space. And one of the reasons why is because, of course, people fear nuclear war, and it's understandable why. However, sometimes I think that prevents us from recognizing, look, this is a capability these types of adversaries will leverage well before actually employing them on the battlefield. But will leverage through their leadership rhetoric, will leverage through other means to try to get things that they want that have bad outcomes for the U.S. and its allies. So one of our hopes with the project is, can we make a compelling argument to the broader foreign and national security policy community that one of the reasons these types of systems is so important isn't just because of their nuclear battlefield effects, but because of the way that China has integrated it into a broader strategy of potential theater aggression, to a broader policy of coercing U.S. allies and partners in ways that we need to respond to both in terms of nuclear deterrence, but also in conventional ways and with other tools in the U.S. toolkit as well.
Yeah, I'll briefly bring this back to understanding the adversary's point of view. China recognizes, obviously, conventional forces are going to be at the center of any kind of crisis or conflict in their neighborhood. They also recognize the emergence of really important key domains like cyber and space, which are becoming more and more integrated into daily life and military life as well. Advanced technologies like AI and machine learning, coordinated drone swarms, advanced conventional capabilities. All of that China recognizes. Those different domains are going to play a part in their deterrence and in their warfighting approach. King among all of those, from China's point of view, are nuclear weapons. I mean, nuclear deterrence in China's mind's eye is really the bedrock. They often call it the backstop of all other forms of deterrence in warfighting. And so because those weapons have pride of place, it's critical for U.S. policymakers, decision makers, analysts, and anybody with an interest in foreign policy and national security to understand the basics of nuclear deterrence and what that means, especially as we're entering an era where we need more people putting critical thought and intellectual capital into assessing nuclear deterrence, because the world looks different than it did during the Cold War. We have more nuclear pieces on the chessboard, so to speak, and they're much more capable and they're much more dangerous. And so with that point of view from the adversary, seeing how important nuclear weapons are to them, it's important that we get a better understanding of them as well.
Well, it's a good way to kind of transition, point to transition on future research. So I guess what kind of future research do you recommend on this topic?
Well, I'll start with a kind of another finding that we found, the third and unfortunately the smallest bin of our results, and that deals with risk reduction and arms control. Okay. I think the general consensus among arms control analysts and practitioners is that things are really bleak, to put it bluntly. Treaties are falling by the wayside, the architecture is generally crumbling, things do not look good. But that doesn't mean that we can afford to fall asleep and potentially miss an opportunity. Risk reduction is going to be a critically important part of any integrated deterrence strategy, because it gives us that much more certainty and predictability in what is already a really volatile, highly sensitive set of conditions. And so I think future research has to include risk reduction and arms control, bleak as prospects might seem right now, because we can't afford to lose that national capability to implement arms control treaties or agreements if that opportunity arises. We would miss so much if we were to lose that capability. And there's also the possibility that unexpected doors might open up. I mean, there's a historical precedent for that happening.
Right. I think that it's important to look both at China and other countries that are expanding their nuclear arsenals and ask ourselves some very close questions about what this means, not just for the purposes of things nuclear, but again, what is that going to mean for how they conduct conventional operations? What does that mean for how they might attempt to dominate the information domain, to include through nuclear saber rattling? What does that mean for how they might try to use other levers? They might use it to support other levers to coerce our allies and partners. When I first started within the field, there was a sense that the nuclear era was either maybe not over, but receding. Nuclear weapons seemed to be less and less important on the international stage. And that's now completely flipped. Nuclear weapons have sort of never been more prominent since the end of the Cold War within international affairs. Multiple states, not just the ones that we've discussed here, are pursuing larger and more diverse nuclear arsenals. This is an area that went under-examined for a while, and now is sort of back in force. And that has a lot of challenging implications for anybody studying national security issues, that there's a lot of spade work to be done.
And Chris, Justin, thank you both so much for joining us today. Yeah. Thank you for sharing your insights, your research, and we hope to have you back on the show in the future, and especially with future research that you do.
Anytime.
Yeah, we're happy to spread the bad news as far and wide as we possibly can.
Awesome.
Thank you both so much.
Thank you.